Happy Monday. So we finished Bud Not Buddy, and I am going to read another historic fiction book. We have kind of 2 weeks left of school, technically 2.5. So, Mr. Litt, how are we going to finish the book? You are going to finish the book this summer. I am announcing a summer reading assignment. I've actually loaded it as an audiobook. I have it loaded on YouTube. I'm working on loading it on another sound site that loads faster and easier. The book is Chains by Laurie Hall Sanderson. Well, there we go, Chains. And I like reading historic fiction because we learn a lot of history and social studies through the people. Okay, so I'm going to read the back to get familiar with it. I have the back. Well, I read the back somewhere else. There we go. Well, the book is about a slave girl in New York just before and then during the American Revolution. So we get to see New York City during the American Revolution, which is super interesting because it goes through quite a change. But then we also get to check in on the issue of slavery during the American Revolution. Slavery during the American Revolution was quite an issue because 1/5 of the population of the United States was in slavery. And a lot of the revolutionary leaders like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, even Benjamin Franklin owned slaves. Now, as they're saying liberty for all, freedom for all, some of them start to think, oh man, that really means for all. George Washington and Benjamin Franklin started to change their mind as they got older. Thomas Jefferson, too. And they wrote in their will that their slaves would go free when they died. Problem is a lot of slaves died before them. And also, they wouldn't free the slaves while they're still alive. So, a lot of the riches and the money that the richer people in America had were profits from things that were made by slave labor. That was the big issue. And I think you've heard it said that a lot of the riches and the infrastructure that America is built on, that has made America so prosperous, was really made by the work of slaves. Okay, so the book takes place in New York City. New York City has a population of about 25,000 at that point, and it's the second biggest colony. I'm attaching a map link on the YouTube description. I'd like you to look at it. Manhattan, it looks long, kind of like a weird shaped hot dog. And what I've been teaching, I couldn't write on the board, is New York City is the best example of what's called geographic determinism. That is, the geography determines what happens there. So New York is one of the best natural harbors there is. And it's really close to the ocean. It's inland just enough to be safe from big storms, but it's close enough that you just sail right in and you're able to pull a ship right up. The Native Americans used it as a meeting ground before. It had a vast animal population before. The Dutch founded it as a trading post pretty fast during the early days of exploration. The English took it over from the Dutch without a fight. They just showed up with a bunch of guns and said, we want it. And the Dutch were like, okay, take it. And that was 1624 and then 1664. So New York City started at the tip of the hot dog, the natural harbor Manhattan, and it started to slowly grow up. So by the time the American Revolution happened, there's the tip of Manhattan, which is a little city, and then there's it stretched about a mile past the original Dutch city of New Amsterdam. Now, when the Dutch made a city of New York, they put a wall across the tip. I think you'll be able to see that in the map. And that's why they call that street Wall Street. You hear Wall Street in the news all the time because that's where they trade a lot of stocks for companies. And they used to trade on Wall Street stocks and companies under a tree. They used to just meet there and just do that. and the tradition stayed. But it's called Wall Street because there was a wall supposed to keep those cities safe during those times. Well, by the time the British were making the city happen in the American Revolution, the city had gone a mile past the wall. Now, one of the widest streets in that old Dutch city was called Broadway because it was broad, it was wide, and it was a street. It was the way. So that's why they called it the Broad Way. So Broadway, though, was one of the first streets mapped out in New York, and it went past the wall and all the way up the island of Manhattan. It kind of goes across it, but it goes the long way. So Broadway stayed, and you hear about Broadway shows and this and that, but Broadway goes originally back to the New York City street. And the city went a mile kind of past the old fort with some big mansions up Broadway. I'm going to be doing more about New York, but let's just jump right into the book. It's a pretty intense book, and it's about a girl, and she is about to be freed, but there's a catch. Chapter 1, Of Chains. The best time to talk to ghosts is before the sun comes up. That's when they can hear us, Mama said. That's when ghosts can answer us. The eastern sky was peach-colored, and a handful of lazy stars still blinked in the west. It was almost time. I asked, "May I run ahead, sir?" Pastor Weeks sat at the front of his squeaky wagon with old Ben next to him. A pastor's a priest. The mule's reins loose in his hands, the pine coffin that held Miss Mary Finch, wearing her best dress, with her hair washed, cleaned, and combed, bounced in the back when the wagon wheels hit a rut. My sister Ruth sat next to the coffin. Ruth was too big to carry, plus the pastor knew about her peculiar manner of being, so it was the wagon for her and the road for me. So in the first 2 paragraphs, we've met a lot of people. We've met Miss Mary Finch, who used to own our slave girl. Her sister is Ruth. The pastor, where he's not going to be a big player, but he's just a player in this chapter, is burying her. And they're off to the cemetery, and Miss Mary Finch owned these 2 girls, but she's passed away now. Pastor Weeks turned around to talk to Mr. Robert Finch, who rode his horse a few lengths behind the wagon. The child wants to run ahead, the pastor explained to him. She has kin buried here. Do you give leave to such a quick visit? Mr. Robert's mouth tightened like a rope pulled taut. He had showed up a few weeks later to visit Miss Mary Finch, his only aunt and his only living relation. He looked around her tidy farm, he listened to her ragged, wet cough, and he moved in. Miss Mary wasn't even cold on her deathbed when he helped himself to the coins in the strong box. He hurried along her burying too, most improper. Ungrateful nephew of Miss Mary Finch, Robert Finch. He didn't care that the neighbors would want to come around with cakes and platters of cold meat and drink ale to the memory of Miss Mary Finch. Miss Mary Finch, originally of 2, Rhode Island. He had to get on with things, he said. I stole a backward look. Mr. Robert Finch was filled up with trouble from his dirty boots to the brim of his scraggly hat. Please, sir, I said. You go, then. But don't tarry. I've much business today. I ran as fast as I could. I hurried past the stone fence that surrounded the white graveyard to the split rail fence that marked our ground, slave burial ground, and stopped outside the gate to pick up a handful of chilly violets wet with dew. The morning mist twisted and hung low over the field. No ghosts yet, just ash trees and maples. I entered. Mama was buried in the back. Her feet to the east, her head to the west. Someday I would pay the stone carver for a proper marker, and it would say Dinah, wife of Cuff, mother of Isabel and Ruth. And that's our main characters, Isabel and Ruth. This is Isabel talking. And that's Isabel on the cover. We buried her here the year before, when the first roses blooms. Smallpox is tricky, Miss Mary Finch said to me when Mama died. There's no telling who it'll take. The pox had left Ruth and me with scars like tiny stars scattered on our skin. It took Mama to our maker. So smallpox was kind of like a measles type virus that went around back then. And yeah, people died from it. People survived it. Sound familiar? I look back at the old road. Old Ben slowed the mules to give me time. I knelt down and set the violets on the grave. It's here, Mama. The day you promised. I need your help. Cross back over for just a little bit. I stared without blinking at the mist, looking at the curve of her, the back of the silver hat wrapped in a pretty kerchief. A small flock of robins swooped out of the maple trees. I don't have much time, I told the grass-covered grave. Where do you want us to go? What should we do, Mama? The mist swirled between the tall grass and the low-hanging branches. 2 butterflies danced. Whoa! Old Ben stopped the wagon next to the open hole near the iron fence, and he climbed down and he walked to where Nehemiah, the gravedigger, was waiting for us. They reached the coffin. Please, Mama, I need your help. No ghosts, nothing. I've been making like this for near a year. No matter what I said or where the sun or moon or the stars hung, Mama didn't answer. Maybe she was angry because I buried her wrong. I heard stories of old country burials with singers and dancers, but I wasn't sure what to do. We dug a hole, and we said a whole bunch of prayers. Maybe Mama's ghost was lost and wondering. I didn't send her home the right way, maybe. The men set Miss Mary's coffin on the ground. Mr. Robert got off his horse and said something I couldn't hear. Ruth stayed in the wagon, her bare feet curled up under her skirt and her thumb in her mouth. I reached the pocket of my apron and took out the oat cake. It was in 2 pieces, with honey smeared between them. The smell made my stomach rumble, but I didn't dare nibble. I picked up the flat rock in front of the cross and set the offering of it under it. Then I put the rock back still, my eyes closed tight to keep the tears inside my head where they belong. Just make an offering to the spirit of her mama. I could smell the honey that dripped in my hands, the damp ground under me, the salt of the ocean. I could hear the cows mooing in a far pasture, bees buzzing in a nearby clover patch. If she would just say my name once. Girl, Mr. Roberts shouted. You there, girl. I sniffed. I opened my eyes and I wiped my face on my sleeve. The ghosts had all gone to the ground. I wouldn't see her today. He grabbed my arm and he pulled me roughly to my feet. I told you to move, he snarled. My apologies, sir, said Isabella. He released me with a shove and he pointed to the cemetery where they buried white people. Go pray for you. Her that owned you, girl. All right, so that is the first chapter of Chains. And it's a very good book. It was written recently, so it's considered a more recent interpretation. And unlike Johnny Tremaine or a lot of these other revolutionary stories, it is from the point of view of a slave. I'm going to do a slight plot spoiler for the next chapter. She was supposed to have been freed when Miss Mary died, but Mr. Robert has other plans. And like a lot of slaves in that time, abolitionism hadn't really started and there wasn't a lot of rights. It was a bad situation. All right, this book unfolds and gets pretty enthralling. And I'll be mixing in a little bit of Revolutionary War history and New York City history. And it'll be a good time. And then this summer, I would like for you to just listen to the rest of the audiobook. I bet you we'll get about a third of the way to halfway of the book before the school year is out. Okay? And then you get to finish it. And then you get to wonder when you're going to read the other 2 books in the series. It's a 3-book series. And it's a prize winner. And it came out 2008. Came out 2008. So 12 years ago. That's considered recent. Johnny Tremaine was written in 1946. So 2008 is considered more recent. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow on the Zoom meeting. Have a good one.